Our guest today, joining us from Beppu City in Oita Prefecture, Japan, is Professor Yoichiro Sato. Professor Sato currently teaches at Ritsumeikan Asia-Pacific University in Oita Prefecture, and he is the Dean of the Department and the Graduate School of Asia-Pacific Studies. Previously, he has also taught at the U.S. Department of Defense's Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, Auckland University in New Zealand, Kansai Gaidai, Hawaii College, and University of Hawaii. I highly recommend his books. His major works include The Rise of China and International Security, the US-Japan Security Alliance, and Re-Rising Japan, among other publications. Professor Sato's Twitter account is packed with useful information and updates. His Twitter handle is @Yoichiro Sato 2. So I'm going to repeat that. The @ YOICHIROSATO, the number 2. Professor Sato, thank you for joining us again. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you, Ted.
Well, outstanding. I'm so delighted you're here. I have so many questions to ask about what's going on in Japan and the broader Indo-Pacific. There's a lot going on. It's a busy time. Japan will hold the 49th general election of members of the House of Representatives on October 31. Voting will take place in all representatives' constituencies. Professor Sato, in addition to the current pandemic, what are some of the other issues on voters' minds for the upcoming election?
I think everything domestic is on the table right now, and from economy, post-pandemic recovery of the economy, especially for those who are in severely hit service sectors, whether it's restaurant business or bars or other kind of entertainment and event organizers, and all of those groups will be looking forward to the additional assistance from the government. And the other issue will be more of a long-standing issue, which doesn't really root in COVID, but the child care issues and the declining rate of childbirth. Those are very important issues as well, especially for women who have young children. They need a better support from the government, and also the better access to child care facilities and so forth. And again, another related issue would be employment for women in general. Abe talked about, Prime Minister Abe talked about this issue. He called it womanomics, but where he did very little to promote, the better working environment for women, and also in working equality for women as well. And related to that would be the issue of education. And during the last few years, for example, discrimination against the female applicants in the medical schools became a big issue, and the universities were discriminating against women on the presumption that they will not work for a long time like men do. And this was a really bad case. The university's reputations were really tarnished after the disclosure of such scandals. So that's another issue. And the pension issue for old people, that's a huge one. And pension reform is another kind of long-standing agenda, and the ongoing pandemic made it even worse for the senior people whose sole income is depend on the low amount of pension. And yeah, and all of those involve money, and because of this, last 2 years of the emergency spending for the COVID measures, the government fiscal condition is worsening, and there has been a talk of a tax reform, major tax reform, and that's a very unpopular item to talk before the election. So, but of course, the opposition party will try to exploit that against the ruling party. So I don't think it can be completely avoided.
From time to time, the Japanese press will publish stories about economic disparities within Japanese society. Is this a growing issue on voters' minds?
Yes, the disparities of many different kinds have been discussed in public quite actively. And I think in most cases, the disparities are attributed to the neoliberal, economic policy reform of this century, starting under the Koizumi administration some 20 years ago. And the opposition party, who is on the liberal side of the ideological spectrum, they're flirting with cooperating with the Communist Party. And, this coalition will heavily emphasize these disparity issues, trying to get the votes from the segment of the population who consider themselves as dropping off the middle class.
Is nuclear power an issue that will play a part in the general election?
This might have if Kono won the LDP primary, but I was paying attention to the stock price for TEPCO, the Tokyo Power and Electric Company, and it was interesting. The up and downs of this company's stock was very much influenced by the support rate for Kono's candidacy for the LDP leadership, because Kono announced that he was against the nuclear power, and he also tag teamed with Koizumi, whose father, the late prime minister, he also, jumped on this anti-nuclear bandwagon some time ago, together with another former prime minister, Hosokawa, who's enjoying life of retiree, doing pottery and things like that. So anyway, but Kishida won, and the stock market up and down somewhat subsided, and I think the market is feeling confident that LDP is not going to change its nuclear power policy.
How about foreign policy? Will that be a factor in the general election coming up?
In abstract sense, yes, but the public opinion is very much in favor of stronger defense in general. And so it's very difficult for the opposition party to attack the LDP on the foreign policy ground. Like saying things like, better negotiated, settlement of the disputed territory with China, and, doesn't make the party popular. So even the liberal parties, they are quite, quiet on foreign policy issues. And I think there's general support for, very broad general support for the kind of foreign policy we witnessed under Abe and Suga. So the Kishida can just say, he's towing the line and continuing the LDP policy.
Recent past Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide was unpopular due to many in Japan thinking that his COVID-19 policies were burdensome with states of emergencies that placed all sorts of restrictions on business activity and other aspects of life. In addition, new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, his poll numbers are low for a new Prime Minister. Do you think that Mr. Suga's low poll ratings and current Prime Minister Kishida's lower than usual poll numbers will harm the Liberal Democratic Party and the Komei Party's ruling coalition chances in the upcoming general election? And if so, will this translate into lost seats, and how many? Yeah.
In my view, the coalition will probably lose some seats and opposition party will gain, but not by a huge margin to enable a change of the government. So I say this because yes, there was an opportunity for the LDP to put Kono up front as the next leader and galvanize popular support for the party. But the very fact that the party didn't opt for it and decided to choose its new leader through a more traditional, the bargaining among the faction leaders and oftentimes behind the scene. And they elected Kishida through this method. So my sense is that the party doesn't feel the sense of urgency. And this is because opposition parties are so weak. And, the Edano couldn't fully integrate the members of the former Democratic Party. So there's one faction on the centrist side of the party who didn't join the Edano's party, which is called the Constitutional Democratic Party. And as I said earlier, the Constitutional Democratic Party has been flirting with policy cooperation with the Communist Party, and even on the electoral district level, they are kind of avoiding running candidates against each other. And the centrist wing of the former Democratic Party, they, for them, cooperation with communists is just no, it's just a taboo for them. And they're not going to join Edano to step up the opposition strength against the ruling Liberal Democratic Party.
The current governor of Tokyo, Yuriko Koike, is someone who's had a very distinguished career. She served in the lower house for a number of years, former Minister of Defense, Minister for, I believe, Okinawa Affairs. Do you at some point anticipate that she will run for a lower house seat again? And if so, what is your sense of the timing of that?
a difficult question. I mean, some speculated that she might do it this time, but I mean, I think she lost the momentum by several factors. One was that, she had an opportunity to make name for herself if she managed the pandemic in Tokyo well. But the fifth wave over this summer pretty much crashed that. And Koike herself, her health condition over this summer wasn't good. I think she was basically overworked during this pandemic period. And she was pretty much absent from the leadership role in the public eyes during the worst of the pandemic. So this really hurt her chance to challenge the LDP. And another factor was, she would have to run as independent, or most likely by, launching a new party. And she has her own party, the Tokyo First Party. And, but, after winning a seat, she would be nothing unless she joined the coalition with the LDP or, merge her party into the LDP. So for that, she needed friends inside the LDP. But her friends were people like Nikai. And initially, she and Suga had a bad relationship, but during Suga's premiership, they kind of, mend the fence. So she was also close to Suga. But both of them completely lost their power base within the LDP. So Koike doesn't have good friends in the LDP now. So that really hurts her chance of getting into national politics.
President Biden recently announced a new security partnership between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Something which pronounced, I think we call it Arcus or AUKUS. And it's focused on the Indo-Pacific region. That includes the sharing of nuclear submarine technology to Australia, among many other things. How does Japan view this development? And also, how does Southeast Asia view this partnership?
Yes, the AUKUS was really an interesting development coming right after this the face-to-face Quad Summit meeting. And Japanese government so far, only said Japan welcomes the development and takes a position that the AUKUS and Quad are mutually complementary. So, but of course, this kind of, contrast the way French reacted to AUKUS, and not only because the French lost the submarine deal with Australia, but also because French feel excluded. And the question is, don't the Japanese feel excluded? And some people think that might be the case, but my take is that, Japan is happily staying out of a very close, almost an alliance-like arrangement of AUKUS. this is a little bit too much collective defense for Japan to take part in. So Japan Japan prefers multilateral framework, which is either at the discussion level or the multilateral framework that benefit Japan in the kind of one-way direction. So if you remember earlier, Japan was, asking whether Japan could join the Five Eyes intelligence network, US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Japan was saying, how about Six Eyes? And well, Japan haven't gotten the positive answer on that. And with that, Japan feels somewhat, excluded. But there's also a concern on the part of the other five that Japan's domestic law for protection of the secrecy, which was upgraded in 2014, 15, I can't remember quite, but they still think it's insufficient. So knowing that, Japan understand why it's not part of the Five Eyes, and with AUKUS too, Japan is okay just staying out and welcoming it from outside. That would be my interpretation.
Okay. France was upset with the AUKUS arrangements because they lost out on a submarine deal with Australia, which they were providing non-nuclear subs to Australia. Yet, Professor Sato, is there not a role for French submarines, and for that matter, Japanese-made submarines, to countries in the Indo-Pacific who need to build up their navies and their defenses, particularly countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, even Indonesia, which last year had that awful submarine disaster.
Yeah.
Many of these countries don't have adequate naval defenses of their own, and they do feel the encroachment of Chinese vessels in their exclusive economic zone waters.
Right.
Is there a role for French and Japanese submarines that could be provided to these countries? And could there be a financing role on the part of the Quad to buy these submarines for these countries?
Well, let me start with the submarine transfer to Australia first. Before the French got the deal with Australia, the Japanese submarine, Soryu class, was one of the strong contenders to replace the current Australian submarine known as the Collins class. And the Japanese Soryu is not the nuclear-powered submarine, but it has really advanced the propulsion system, and it's large and quiet, very capable submarine. And Japan was gonna try to sell this submarine to Australia, but Australia, under the very strong influence of the laborers, they wanted a significant technology transfer and the local production of the submarine, rather than importing the completed submarine, and that part was very difficult for Japan to do. And the government was very eager to sell submarines, primarily because, it's very symbolic and demonstrating the closer defense partnership between Australia and Japan. But the defense ministry itself, especially the maritime self-defense force, was somewhat concerned about protecting its technology. So that was the background, and but the French deal didn't go through eventually because Australia radically revised its own strategic role in the underwater warfare, and instead of the kind of coastal defense submarine force, which would have been served by conventionally powered the diesel submarines, Australia decided that it needs a long-range submarine deployment capability. So that means it has to be nuclear powered. So they switched to the US and the British technology. So that was in the background. Can the Japanese and Australian submarines be used for enhancing maritime security capability of Southeast Asian littoral countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines? It's not quite that simple. Transferring, submarine equipment is one thing, and transferring the comprehensive capability to maintain it, operate it is quite another. And first of all, the Philippines doesn't have the submarine force, so with the Philippines, it has to be built from scratch. And everybody in the Japanese Coast Guard, they know what happened to the boat they transferred to the Philippines. And, the Japanese are most reluctant to transfer submarines to the Philippines because they become completely dependent for aftercare. And Vietnam is a different story. Vietnam has had, submarine force, but they prefer to buy submarines from Russia. And Russian ones are capable and cheap. And after Vietnam obtained the Russian submarines, India offered the Vietnamese training how to operate Russian submarines, because Indians have had this experience of running Russian-built submarines. So, of course, why is India helping Vietnam? And the reason is quite obvious. India wants to build Vietnam's naval capability vis-a-vis China. It's a balancing act going on. So that and Indonesia, has had submarines, but not much better than the Philippines situations. Teaching Indonesia how to operate the submarine force is gonna be a long-term project. And I don't know if any of the Quad members want to do that right now.
On September 22, Taiwan applied to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or what we used to call the TPP trade bloc.
Right.
This took place a week after China announced that it also submitted an application to join the trade bloc. Do you see the TPP allowing Taiwan to enter that trade group?
I think it's quite likely, and it was really a perfect timing. You know, Taiwan announced its candidacy right after, you know, China expressed its interest. And well, Japan is currently the chair of the CPTPP grouping. So Japan will lead this process of the accession negotiation. But, you know, it has to be based on the agreement with all ratified members, and Taiwan must convince that its trade policy is compliant with all of those the current agreements among the TPP, CPTPP ratified members. Because China is not a member yet, you know, China cannot reject Taiwan's application. And for that very reason, you know, the negotiation with China will be put on the back burner, and negotiation with Taiwan will be processed forward. Yeah. So, and next year the chair moves to Singapore, and unless China convinces Singapore that China has to join CPTPP before Taiwan, it's not going to happen. And I don't think it's easy to convince Singapore to do that. And of course, Japan can unilaterally delay accession talk with China. So, you know, the end result is going to be either Taiwan and China don't get in very soon, or Taiwan gets in first. So for China, it's not a good prospect. And the other thing is, you know, China could try to bully some current members, but the Malaysia and Brunei haven't ratified, so they don't count in the accession talk for China and Taiwan. And I mean, Malaysia and Brunei could be bullied into rejecting Taiwan's application if they have already ratified the treaty, but they have not. So blocking Taiwan is not easy for China. And if Taiwan gets in first, then there will be additional pressure on China to offer a better deal. In other words, you know, China will have to agree to a more progressive liberalization than it is willing to right now.
According to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, yeah. And, you know, whether China is going to join or not will have a huge implication on the United States. Because, you know, if China becomes part of CPTPP and the US stays out of it, there will be strategic implications of that. But of course, US policy making has a life of its own. You know, Washington DC's logic is not necessarily a globally viewing strategic logic. So we'll see what the US will do.
According to Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense, a total of 149 Chinese military aircraft entered Taiwan's air defense identification zone between October 1 through October 4. And last week, Taiwan's defense minister said that tensions with China are at their worst point over the past 40 years. How seriously does Japan view this situation, and what is Japan's policy towards Taiwan right now?
Yeah, well, I have been asked this question recently, and at the official statement, the publicly announced statement level, there has been a slight change. And I think Japan is more explicitly expressing its discontent with the aggressive approach the People's Republic of China is taking against Taiwan. But oftentimes the media misunderstand Japan's traditional policy. They often report that Japan doesn't recognize the Taiwan as a sovereign entity, and Japan's position is that Japan has given up its sovereignty over Taiwan as a result of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. And after that, Japan signed the peace treaty with the Republic of China, which recognized sovereignty of the Republic of China over China, which is implicitly inclusive of the island of Taiwan, but it doesn't make it explicit. And then Japan switched the diplomatic recognition of China, the entity known as China, to the People's Republic of China as a result of the normalization between the two countries. But then the Republic of China government has existed on the island of Taiwan since 1949. So the question remains, who has official sovereignty over the island of Taiwan? Is that the People's Republic of China or the Republic of China? And Japan has not given an answer to that question. Actually, it's not the either or two-choice question. I mean, technically, there's a third possibility that neither one. Japan has given it up, but didn't specify to whom the island of Taiwan go to. So, but anyway, in any case, that is Japan's position. Japan has not recognized the sovereignty of anybody over the island of Taiwan. It's an open question. Well, I mean, PRC doesn't like this. ROC doesn't like it either. And the other stance Japan took is that Japan opposes any change to the status quo other than through negotiation. So the PRC attempt to reconquer Taiwan by force is going to be opposed. And Japan has made that part clear, and recently clearer even.
Japan's new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has retained Nobuo Kishi as Japan's Minister of Defense. Nobuo Kishi is the younger brother of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who remains politically influential. Did Prime Minister Kishida retain Mr. Kishi as Defense Minister in order to create or maintain productive relations with Mr. Abe and his faction, or were there other reasons behind this move?
Well, the factional consideration partly play a role, but I think most importantly, Kishida didn't replace the foreign minister either, Motegi. So both of them, the critical, national security related positions were retained for the purpose of continuity in foreign policy. And I think that was the primary consideration, and the logic of factional politics didn't go against it.
The Quad leaders met at the White House on September 24, where they reiterated their call for a free and open Indo-Pacific. How do you assess the September 24 Quad summit, and did the outcomes align with Japan's interests? And does Japan believe that the Quad is meeting its national interests?
I think that question depends on who you ask within the Japanese government, and I mean, nobody is explicitly complaining, but there are signs that there are some dissatisfaction about the way the Quad statement came about. And for example, yes, the statement reiterated some of the main points about the FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think the open paragraph, talks about this free and open Indo-Pacific and so forth. But unlike some of the earlier meeting, like the foreign ministers summit meeting, not summit, foreign ministers Quad meeting under the Secretary of State Pompeo during the Trump administration. In that time, the statements mentioned China, named China in various instances, but the most recent summit documents stopped short of naming China. So that was seen as a sort of a step back by Japanese conservatives. And also the order of presentation was interesting. I mean, it shows like the Biden color and Kerry's color, the Democratic colors all over. And talking about COVID, in the early part of the statement, well, makes sense, right? And talking about the vaccine cooperation and all that, yeah, sure, fine. But then, following that was the climate change cooperation ahead of maritime security cooperation. And that, must have caught eyes of some of the more sensitive observers. And so with things like that, I think some of the Japanese leaders were not quite happy, but they've opted for just keeping their mouth shut because it only worsens Japan's relations with the Biden administration.
In recent years, we've seen more strategic Japanese diplomacy that is building security partnerships outside of the US-Japan alliance. In particular, we've seen Japan and Australia form a defense pact that their forces will train in each other's countries.
Right.
We've seen the United Kingdom's HMS Queen Elizabeth and its strike group make port calls in Japan for joint exercises. French forces have stepped up their training with their Japanese counterparts, and a German frigate will make a port call in Japan next month. Then, of course, we've seen the Quad enhance their collaborations. What is behind these relationships? Is it solely the threat that Xi Jinping's China poses to a free and open Indo-Pacific? Are there other reasons? And do you see this new strategic diplomacy on the part of Japan continuing going forward?
Well, Japan has been exploring possibilities of diverse partnerships, but none of them are meant for replacement of Japan's primary alliance with the United States. And those new alignment Japan is exploring with countries like UK, France, and Australia, Germany, and well, Australia is of a higher grade than the other partners, but still it's very much built in a trilateral cooperative framework among US, Japan, and Australia. So it's very much embedded bilateral partnerships within the trilateral cooperative framework. So, and others too, if you see recent maritime joint exercises, you see kind of Quad plus framework emerging. Sometimes it's Quad plus UK, sometimes it's Quad plus Canada, sometimes Quad plus France, or sometimes 3 of the Quad plus another external parties and so forth. So the Quad is very much in the center of extended cooperation. So Japan's using this the Quad-centric framework primarily for the purpose of cultivating new partnerships, but also anchoring U.S. commitment to the security of Indo-Pacific. And the Europeans also see it in a similar way. They want to anchor U.S. commitment to NATO defense, but for them there is a dilemma because Trump has been, well, he was telling Europeans, you have to keep your promise and spend 2% of the gross domestic product on defense. And some Europeans, they met the target, and others, they're like, yeah, don't worry, America will protect us, and they didn't. But under that kind of pressure, if Europeans do more, that gives US more reason not to do more. In other words, the burden will be shifted because America doesn't see Russia as the primary threat. America sees China as the primary threat. So Europeans, they don't do more in Europe, but they tell the Americans, we'll do more in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. So European interest and Japanese interest, they are kind of, meeting each other very well in this Quad-centric framework.
Some critics of the Quad say that the partnership seeks to be an Asian NATO and that it is attempting to supplant ASEAN's traditional role in the region, thereby becoming a destabilizing force. How does Tokyo respond to these criticisms?
Well, Tokyo has never said that Quad is meant to be a kind of a NATO-like multilateral collective defense. And, the government documents doesn't even use the term Quad. If you visit Japanese MOFA website, you see Japan, US, Australia, India, what is it that dialogue, summit dialogue or foreign ministers meeting, and that is the official title, and they don't call it quadrilateral meeting. So for them, for Japan, it's still a dialogue framework, and various cooperation, does happen, but there is no plan to upgrade Quad as a treaty arrangement. Okay. But of course, China wants to picture it differently. So, and I think Quad members are quite cautious enough not to let China, run this kind of anti-Quad propaganda. So, the most recent Quad summit document, in the very early part of it, acknowledges the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, and emphasizes that the Quad members basically respect the ASEAN-centric, way of approaching the Indo-Pacific, and those, I think that kind of language wouldn't have appeared under the Trump administrations, but Japan would have always recommended that, and the Biden administration officials, who have more understanding and sympathetic stance toward the ASEAN countries, they basically accepted the Japanese recommendations to, leave the ASEAN-centric language in the document.
Professor Sato, as perceptions of security threats from China intensify, and as North Korean missile launches continue, do you see Japan at some point allowing US intermediate range missiles to be stationed on Japanese soil to strengthen deterrence, or is that politically just a no-go?
I would say it's a no-go. I mean, strategic means nuclear armed intermediate range missiles, right?
Well, I think some of the concern is that there's a missile gap.
Yeah.
And to serve as some deterrence, maybe they'd be conventional, not necessarily nuclear warheads.
Oh, okay. Well, the conventional intermediate range missiles to counter the missile threat from North Korea and China, that has been discussed. And actually, during this the LDP primary, I think Takaichi said something to that effect. Japan should accept the US intermediate range missiles onto Japanese soil. And the other three candidates, they dodged the question by saying that, they don't want to answer a hypothetical question like that because US hasn't officially requested as such. So, there has been talk of it, but I think Japanese preference would be that those missiles be deployed either on board US naval vessels, whether submarine or surface ships, or onto some other island countries like Palau, which is kind of shifting back to the pro-US side, and the Philippines will be difficult unless they change constitution, and so yeah, there aren't many places US can place those missiles on the ground.
There is concern that the status quo of the Indo-Pacific security balance is changing due to China's continued military modernization. What military capabilities does Japan need and want in order to address the threat posed by China?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question. The LDP manifesto for the upcoming election said that Japan should consider increasing the defense budget to 2% or even more of the gross domestic product. And this, if that happens, it's gonna be a significant increase because currently the defense budget is only about 1% of the gross domestic products. So doubling the amount, hey, it's a shopping time. But I doubt it will happen. But let's say, if the budget will increase, and what should Japan buy first? That's a hard question because there are so many things Japan wants to do, develop, better drones and, the missile defense, and some are talking about the ground attack capability to disrupt the so-called kill chain of the missile launch, and other things, the satellite space-based intelligence gathering, and they were also talking about kind of a spaceship to patrol the outer space for protection of critical satellites and things like that. And I mean, all of those things cost a huge amount of money. Yeah. And I don't know if Japan can, do much of those shopping. I mean,
Relations between Japan and South Korea remain fraught with tensions, despite both countries sharing a common adversary, North Korea, as well as both countries having their own issues with China. In your view, Professor Sato, what measures are needed to improve relations between Tokyo and Seoul?
Yeah, that's another $1 million question. The relationship has gone up and down, partly due to the change of government on the Korean side, and the current the progressive groups in South Korea, they are not the easy partner to work with for Japan. And if the conservatives came, if they can come back to control the government, that would make it slightly easier for Japan. but not by a huge margin. Because if you remember, even under the Miss Park's government, Japan had a fairly difficult relationship with South Korea. So that's, I think, due to a kind of a bigger geostrategic factor at work. You know, the Korea's kind of unfortunate identity as an amphibious state between the land power and maritime power is making a full reconciliation between Korea and Japan difficult. But having said that, I also see a kind of generational change. The new generation of South Koreans, they don't hate the Japanese the same way that, the older generations did. So I think it's possible that the two countries will, come up with more pragmatic views toward each other and, act more kind of rationally rather than emotionally. I can only hope that. Yeah.
And finally, Professor Sato, a question about Japanese cuisine for you, if I may.
Yeah.
The fall season is now upon us. And typically when the seasons change in Japan, the food changes.
Yes.
To some degree. Has the range and selection of foods changed for you and your family now that we are in autumn? And if so, what are you and your family eating?
Well, I enjoy a couple of the autumn things, whether it's vegetable or fruits. And the eggplants in autumn is really good. We are at the kind of tail end of the season, and yeah, I'm cooking the mapo, the Chinese style,
Okay.
and also the Japanese pears are really good right now.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, juicy pears.
Fantastic. What about seafood?
Seafood, yes, it's a good time to catch some of the migratory fish like yellowtail, and the snapper's also good right now. Yep.
Excellent. Well, Professor Sato, I really appreciate you making all this time. It's always fascinating to speak with you, particularly about all these timely subjects that really mean so much to the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. All the best.